There are crimes that don't end. They don't fade with time. They don't stay buried in old files or forgotten headlines. They linger in unanswered questions, in empty spaces where someone should still be. This is Quiet Witness Chronicles, where the cases that went silent are given a voice again. Tonight, we're not just asking what happened. We're asking who knew and said nothing. At 4:30 a.m., the parking lot was empty. At 4:40, a car door slammed. At 4:45, someone screamed, or maybe struggled, long enough for neighbors to notice, but not long enough to stop what was happening. By 6 a.m., a morning news anchor had vanished. This isn't just the story of a missing woman. It's the story of a crime that may have lasted less than 5 minutes, and a mystery that's lasted nearly 3 decades. This is the disappearance of Jodi Huisentruit. Jodi, bright, competitive, ambitious. She wasn't just a local news anchor. She was the future. Colleagues at KIMT TV described her as relentlessly driven. She ran marathons. She chased promotions. She wanted a bigger market. But behind the polished smile on TV, there were whispers. Friends later said Jodi believed someone was watching her. She mentioned being followed. She told people about strange encounters, men she didn't recognize, moments that felt off. Nothing concrete, nothing police could act on. Until June 27th, 1995. That Tuesday morning, Jodi was late. For a morning anchor, that was unheard of. At 6 a.m., her co-anchor called her apartment. No answer. By 7, a coworker drove to her place, the Key Apartments in Mason City. What they found wasn't silence. It was evidence. Her red Mazda Miata sat in the lot. The driver's door was open. Her high heels were on the ground. Her bent car key lay twisted as if wrenched from the ignition. Nearby, drag marks. This wasn't a disappearance. This was a violent interruption. Investigators believe the entire abduction happened between 4:30 and 4:45 a.m. Think about that. 15 minutes. Dark. Quiet. At least one neighbor reported hearing a scream. Another heard what sounded like a struggle. But no one looked outside, because nothing about it sounded unusual enough. That's the most terrifying part of this case, how quickly violence can hide inside normal sounds. Police processed the scene. They found palm prints on Jodi's car, items scattered as if she'd been forced back or pulled away. No blood, no weapon, no witnesses who saw a face. In the mid-90s, surveillance cameras were rare. Cell phones didn't track movement. DNA science wasn't where it is now. The trail went cold almost immediately. But investigators believed one thing from the start. This was targeted. Over the years, one theory refused to die: that Jodi had a stalker. Friends recalled her unease. Strangers had approached her because she was recognizable on TV. At least one man was reportedly obsessed with her schedule. Morning anchors are predictable. Same time, same route, same routine. If someone wanted her, they didn't need to guess when she'd be there. They just had to wait. By the end of the first week, the urgency was already slipping. Not because investigators didn't care, but because the case offered nothing solid to hold on to. No body, no weapon, no confirmed witness who could say, "That's him." And that absence created a dangerous vacuum. From the beginning, law enforcement believed one thing with near certainty: Jodi did not leave on her own. The evidence made that clear. What wasn't clear, then or now, was who had stepped into her life quietly enough to remove her from it. Over the years, investigators examined dozens of potential persons of interest. Some were men who had shown an unusual interest in Jodi. Some were people who lived nearby. Some were individuals whose behavior raised red flags only in hindsight. But none could be definitively placed at the scene, and that became the pattern. A name would surface, a theory would build, hope would spike, and then nothing. No physical proof, no confession, no corroboration strong enough to survive court scrutiny. Each time, the case reset. And resets are expensive. In the early days, investigators faced intense pressure. Media attention was national. Tips flooded in from across the country. Every phone call felt urgent. But urgency doesn't always sharpen focus. Sometimes it scatters it. Some early leads were pursued aggressively. Others, critics argue, weren't followed deeply enough. Witness statements were taken quickly, sometimes without the benefit of context that would only become clear later. And once time passes, memory doesn't just fade, it changes. That's one of the cruel realities of unsolved cases. The truth doesn't disappear, but it becomes harder to recognize. From the beginning, investigators circled one idea again and again: that Jodi was being watched before she was taken. Friends later recalled her unease, her sense that someone knew her routines too well, her comments that, at the time, didn't seem alarming enough to escalate. But stalking rarely announces itself clearly. It hides in repetition, in coincidence, in the space between strange and dangerous. And by the time that line is crossed, it's often too late. People often ask the same question: how can there be so much suspicion and no arrests? The answer is uncomfortable. Prosecutors don't build cases on belief. They build them on proof. Circumstantial evidence can suggest motive. Behavior can suggest opportunity. But without forensic confirmation or credible eyewitness testimony, cases collapse under cross-examination. And investigators know this. Charging the wrong person wouldn't just fail, it would permanently damage the case. So the standard remains high, painfully high. As years passed, people moved away. Some witnesses died. Others convinced themselves their memories were unreliable, and silence filled the gaps. But silence isn't neutral. It protects whoever benefits from it most. The person responsible didn't need to hide forever. They only needed to stay quiet long enough for doubt to spread. And doubt is a powerful shield. Despite criticism, one thing never happened. The file was never sealed. The investigation was never declared over. Law enforcement has repeatedly stated that key details have been withheld from the public, not out of secrecy, but strategy. Because in cases like this, one wrong word can warn the wrong person, and one right word from the right person can end everything. The most disturbing possibility isn't that police failed to identify a suspect. It's that they did, but couldn't prove it. That someone may have lived in plain sight, carrying knowledge no one else could confirm, protected not by innocence, but by the absence of evidence. And until that silence breaks, this chapter of the case remains exactly where it started: open, unfinished, and waiting. Time didn't erase this case. It only changed how investigators were finally able to look at it. For years, the disappearance of Jodi sat at the edge of law enforcement memory, too old to dominate headlines, too disturbing to ever truly go away. But silence has a shelf life. And as technology evolved, so did the questions. In the decades since Jodi vanished, investigators quietly began reopening doors that had once been closed. Not because they lacked effort in 1995, but because the tools simply didn't exist yet. Old palm prints were re-examined. Physical evidence was recatalogued. Witness statements, some taken half a lifetime ago, were read again, this time with a sharper eye. Not for what they said, but for what they didn't. One of the most haunting realities of this case is that the crime scene itself still speaks. The bent car key suggests panic. The scattered items suggest resistance. The absence of blood suggests control. This wasn't chaos. It was interruption, and that detail matters. In recent years, investigators have returned to locations long associated with tips, places that, for decades, produced rumors but no proof. Using ground-penetrating radar, law enforcement searched rural areas tied to past leads, fields, properties, stretches of land where witnesses once claimed something felt wrong. Nothing publicly conclusive was announced, but those searches weren't symbolic. They were deliberate. Because police don't return to old ground unless they believe something or someone was missed. As time passes, one thing changes. People talk differently. Relationships end. Fear fades. Loyalties shift. Investigators know this. That's why cold cases are sometimes solved not by new science, but by old secrets finally losing their grip. Authorities have confirmed they continue to receive tips about Jodi's case. Some from people who were too young to speak in 1995, others from people who waited decades to come forward. And that's one of the most unsettling aspects of this mystery. Someone, somewhere, may have known the truth almost immediately and chose to carry it alone. Law enforcement has never declared Jodi legally dead. They have never closed the file, and they have never said the evidence is exhausted. Instead, they've repeated the same quiet message for years. This case is solvable. That belief alone tells us something crucial. It means there is evidence the public has never seen, details intentionally withheld, information protected, waiting for the right voice to unlock it. Because in cases like this, one sentence can undo decades of silence. If Jodi's disappearance happened today, it would look very different. Cameras would track her movements. Phones would log her location. License plates would be scanned. Faces would be captured. But in 1995, darkness moved faster than technology. And whoever took her may have understood that, understood how thin the line was between being seen and being gone. That's why this case refuses to fade, because it sits at the crossroads of timing, opportunity, and intent. And because somewhere in the overlap of those three things, the truth still exists, waiting. As investigators revisited the disappearance of Jodi, one realization became unavoidable. This wasn't random, and it wasn't impulsive. It was planned. Behavioral analysts who study long unsolved abductions agree on one chilling point. Crimes that leave so little evidence are rarely committed by chaotic people. They're committed by someone who can wait. The offender likely knew Jodi's schedule, knew the parking lot, knew the silence of early morning. This wasn't a predator who struck when opportunity appeared. This was someone who created the opportunity, someone who stood in the dark, rehearsing the moment. The physical evidence tells a quiet story of dominance. The bent car key suggests panic, but not prolonged struggle. The scattered items suggest resistance, but not enough time to escape. The lack of blood suggests restraint. This points toward an offender comfortable with control, someone who could act decisively under pressure, someone who didn't need to improvise because they'd already imagined every step. That kind of offender doesn't just disappear afterward. They return to normal life. The most dangerous offenders aren't violent all the time. They're ordinary most of the time. They hold jobs. They speak calmly. They show up to work the next day. They don't brag. They don't confess. They observe. And if this person knew Jodi, even casually, the psychological advantage deepens. Because familiarity breeds access. Stalking isn't always obvious. Sometimes it looks like coincidence. Sometimes it hides behind repeated chance encounters. Sometimes it exists entirely in the mind of the person watching. Morning anchors are uniquely vulnerable, predictable, visible, trusted. For someone craving significance or control, proximity to a public figure can feel like intimacy. even when none exists. And when fantasy collides with rejection or fear of exposure, violence can follow. Most people believe guilt erodes people over time, but some personalities experience the opposite. They compartmentalize, they justify, they rewrite memory. For them, silence isn't pressure, it's protection, which means the person responsible may still feel safe, still feel unseen, still believe the moment passed unnoticed. That's why this case hasn't ended, because crimes like this don't just vanish. They echo, in behavior, in patterns, in the way someone reacts when the name Jodi Huisentruit is spoken aloud. There is one possibility investigators rarely say out loud, but always consider: that the offender didn't just plan the crime, they planned the aftermath. They anticipated confusion, they relied on darkness, they trusted the limits of 1995 technology, and for nearly 30 years, that trust has held. But time doesn't erase behavior, it exposes it. And somewhere, the person who took Jodi has left traces, in conversations, in routines, in moments that no longer align. This case is still open because someone, somewhere, still knows exactly what happened that morning. And one day, the silence that protected them will fail. Somewhere, the truth about this case already exists, not hidden in a vault, not locked inside a file. It lives in memory, in a moment someone overlooked, in a detail that felt too small to matter until it did. If this story stayed with you, that's not by accident. These cases only move forward when they're remembered, and when silence stops protecting the wrong person. If you believe unresolved cases deserve continued attention, consider subscribing to Quiet Witness Chronicles. We don't chase shock. We don't rush closure. We return to the stories that were left unfinished. Because someone, somewhere, is still waiting to be heard.